Hey folks, Phil Gallagher of ThrabenU here for another Monster Train video. Last night off stream, I finally got my last victory needed to have cleared Covenant rank 25 with all clan combinations, so I'm pretty happy about that. And I wanted to take this opportunity to kind of reflect on each one of the clans and kind of talk about their strengths and weakness a little bit, because I have a much deeper understanding of the clans than I initially did when I started making video content. I thought this was probably the time to break down some things. So we're just going to go kind of clan by clan in order and some things. So let's start with the Hellhorned. In my opinion, and this one is a bit of a hot take, the Hellhorned are often the worst clan when they are your primary clan. Now, I'm going to explain myself there, because I know everyone in the comments is probably already typing about how bad the melting is, but hear me out. In a lot of the early fights where you're not offered the slay and gain attack power Hornbreaker Prince, you don't really have much ability to change your damage output for the regular enemies that you're encountering, and that often means that floors 1 and 2 are trickier than they should be. So Spike's Trials can often give you fits. The Sweep boss on floor 2 can often give you fits. And even something as simple as the non-1 HP enemies in Fight 1 can give you problems, and those often reach the pyre if you don't have the right Hornbreaker Prince. So just pulling up their stats to show that off. If we take a look at the Reaper Hornbreaker Prince, it's plus 19 starting attack power and gaining 10 on slay means that you probably melt that first fight most of the time. But let's compare this to something like Brawler, where your initial output is 12. Assuming that you have a Train Steward and a Hornbreaker Prince on floor 1, that represents 17 damage, and that's going to be your most DPS heavy floor. You can't replicate that same floor output anywhere else, and so that means that unless some of your other starting cards bail you out, things like your Torches and Train Stewards probably don't actually get the kills on those, I think it's 40 HP enemies in Fight 1, so you end up taking a little bit of pyre damage just about every time. And that certainly adds up. And in comparison to other factions where, I don't know, you have 150 starting power, or you have Tethys, or on Tethys later, it definitely feels a little bit underpowered. So on some of your Wrathful or Brawler starts, things are very awkward, and I've often found that a poor Hellhorned primary start is kind of difficult to get through. Kind of along the same lines in terms of early difficulties, if we look at some of the early creatures you might pick up, like Branded Warrior and Horned Warrior, they also have the same HP and spikes problem that the champion often has. So the weaknesses of the Hellhorn, in my opinion, are that floor 1 and 2, when your Hellhorn primary, tend to be trickier than with most other clans as primary. Spikes and Sweep are huge issues early on. A lot of times that's mitigated by later, but not always. And keeping your units alive is tricky in some cases. Going back to the Hellhorn Champion for a minute. The Wrathful Champion is theoretically supposed to be the, tank version of the champion, quote unquote. It's not exactly that, but it's the closest to that. So if you don't get a slay on this unit, though, things get incredibly awkward. So, for example, let's say that, you are in a situation where something deals 5 damage to this, and you don't get a slay. That probably means that your Hornbreaker Prince has died on the next wave. So while the Wrathful Prince can take over fights very easily, if you kind of look at these later stats, like even with 34 life, in a fight like, say, the Seraph fight, and like sometimes you see like 15x2 enemies, those can basically take a Hornbreaker Prince down on its own if it's in the front. So the Wrathful Prince, like, absolutely is going to need support if you're going this route to stay alive. And it's going to need support in this route if you want to do enough damage to make your multi-strike super relevant. It's really only the Reaper, or maybe a combination of Reaper plus Brawler, that is just like totally fine on its own, hiding in the back. Okay, now let's talk about some of the strengths. Torch is an incredibly good tactical starting card that lets you pick off the explosives in the Daedalus fight, the archers in fight 1, healers, spike producers, multi-strikers, and things of that nature. Torch is a very, very good starting card. So the Hellhorned often make a very good support faction that is your secondary faction, because it lets your run be carried by the strengths of the primary clan while getting really good starting support and some overall like powerful utility cards. Sorting by cost for a minute, if we look at the commons that this clan has, Hidden Passage is stupid. Like, this costs 1 and gives you a huge degree of control over a fight, moving tanks out of the way, ascending your units to make a super floor, feeding something to the pyre that doesn't actually do damage, moving the collector to a place where you can kill it. Hidden Passage is incredible at common, and the fact that you can pick up some of these for just about any run is not to be underestimated. This is a card where I'm like very happy to have them in my starting deck, and I'm usually happy to pick up 1 to 2 of them almost no matter what I'm doing in a Hellhorned run. Just kind of talking about everything now. One thing that I like about the Hellhorned is that they have a couple of cards that, relatively speaking, hard carry runs on their own. The most obvious of those is probably One Horn's Tome, with Inferno being the other one. So One Horn's Tome applying multi-strike to, say, your champion, or to a demon fiend, or another critical unit, even something like an alpha fiend, provides an absurd amount of scaling in a single card. And in some sort of high upside scenarios where you, say, have like Volatile Gauge and you remove Consume from this card, it gets stupid very quickly. Double Stack is also pretty insane on this card. Is that card going to be good every run? No, the 5 Ember cost is certainly constrictive. But when it is good, it will probably win you the run, or very close to it, on its own. It does kind of have that problem that many cards do, where drawing it in a wrong spot is quite bad. So a lot of times in your opening hand, you can't play it plus your creature at the same time, or like your tank, for example. And in other scenarios, sorry about that. And in other scenarios, like it's on the bottom of your deck and too many creatures have already gotten through by the time you draw it. But this is a very powerful effect, and not just applied to its own clan. Inferno is the other like hard carry card here, where like giving this cost reduction, giving this holdover, oftentimes makes the Seraph fight going from being like very difficult to a bit of a joke. So these are probably the 2 most powerful Hellhorned cards in terms of like what they do to a run on their own with little other support. But like the quiet champion of the Hellhorned is probably Hidden Passage. That card's great. As far as other things that make the Hellhorn a bit unique, Demon Fiend is an oversized unit that is a little bit difficult or impossible to cast in the early game, but often makes the mid-game a joke. So assuming that you can get this thing into play, it often makes floors 4 through 6 very easy, allowing you to take trials that you otherwise might not have been able to, or like save a decent amount of higher health. Many runs end up revolving directly or indirectly around Demon Fiend, and I often find myself taking risks on Circle 3 and picking a Demon Fiend that I can't cast yet if I think I'm strong enough to get through the Daedalus fight, because this unit ends up being so powerful. You know, when we compare that to other things in the faction, like Railbeater and Alpha Fiend, you know, the size difference is very, very notable. That's most of what I have to say about this unit. In the future, I'd hope for some balance changes within this faction. I feel like the faction has a decent amount of trouble, and that the Imp cards aren't quite there. When you don't have Impsicle, cards like Important Work and Impressive in particular often feel extremely bad or are not even castable. And when you get those cards in your starting deck, and you have some dead cards in your starting deck, it stings a little bit. Okay, on to the Awoken. I love the Awoken quite a bit. I think they are very strong. I guess let's start with their strengths. Again, if we look at commons, the commons for Awoken are very good. So, Sting is like maybe not a card that you pick often, unless you have like artifacts that synergize with it, but Sting is a very powerful starting card. Just giving you that extra velocity in getting through your deck is very important, especially if you miss a critical card the first pass through your deck. These three commons right here often make the backbone of your early game as an Awoken run. Glimmer is an absurdly powerful common. The ability to sweep a floor while also getting triggers on your creatures, whether that's your champion or something like a Thorned Hollow, getting those rejuvenate triggers while also killing units gives it so much more value than something like a Torch does. Razor Sharp Edge synergizes very well with multi-strike creatures in particular, but a lot of your creatures have so much health that like losing 2 max health like literally has no difference in the fight, and this is just an absurd degree of scaling versus bosses. And Wildwood Sap makes a lot of your units that have rejuvenate triggers get dumb very quickly, especially when you draft this in multiples. So if we look at all of these commons, what this means is that your starting deck tends to be very strong when you're Awoken. Like, essentially all of these cards are good. Now, some are worse than others, like you're frequently not super excited about an early Sharpen or anything like that, since it's 2 Ember. But like all of these cards have real utility early on. And that often makes the beginning of runs with Awoken very easy. You know, you Razor Sharp Edge, you know, even just a Train Steward that's hiding behind your champion. And that increases your DPS output quite a bit, making it so that some of those initial units are not making it to the pyre, or are extremely damaged when they do so. Looking more generally at some of the other cards, taking a look at the rares of this faction, I'm pretty impressed by them. Some of these are situational, but I often find that when I'm offered a rare pack as Awoken, I get something. So Wildwood Tome can often just hard carry a run by itself. Unleash the Wildwood can often hard carry a run by itself once you've gone and put something like Holdover on it. Like Holdover, Unleash the Wildwood, plus, you know, a Thorned Hollow, or your champion often provides a stupid amount of tankiness and means that your back units aren't dying in harder fights on circles 7 and 8. Applying quick to things like Animus of Will is extremely strong, or quick to, you know, a card from another faction or a sweep unit is very, very good as well. So I tend to be most impressed by these 1, 2, 3, 4 rares. I tend to take most of these when I'm offered them. Some of the others are situational. Panel Song I have a love-hate relationship with. It is a card that is very, very powerful, but also has a certain amount of, you know, luck associated with it. You can sometimes navigate your fight in a way that makes a Channel Song better by, like, say, not playing a unit the first time through your deck. But this tends to be very awkward while you still have Train Stewards in your deck. Essentially, Shard Channeler, Channel Song, Spreading Spores, and Adaptive Mutation tend to fall in the category of, like, strong but situational. Not every run is going to want them. Whereas Vine Mother and Wilting Sapwood are kind of misses. So, like, while you're not happy to see either one of these most of the time, a lot of your rares are very powerful as Awoken. Let's talk about weaknesses of the Awoken now. The biggest weakness of the Awoken in my mind is that the champion often competes for resources with your other units. The most obvious one is when you get a Rejuvenate Sentient, and then you are offered Thorned Hollow. Thorned Hollow is, in my mind, the best Awoken unit. It scales very, very quickly. It lets you pick off utility enemies just by, like, taking hits, and it's very good at killing bosses as well. The Thorned Hollow does basically everything you need to do in a run other than kill the large units. Like, killing support units and killing bosses in one card is very good. Now, it takes support to do it, obviously, but this is like a build my deck around it card for the most part. But what happens when you're not offered, like, Spike's Sentient on the initial start, and you take Rejuvenate Champion, and then you get offered Thorned Hollow? Like, Thorned Hollow is so strong that you probably take it, but then you end up, like, ignoring your champion, and you get to be in kind of this awkward spot overall. So, it's a problem that you often can play around, because, like, dedicating the resource to the Thorned Hollow is fine, but it's certainly awkward. I also find that I sometimes have Ember problems while playing the Awoken, because when you're wanting to stack regen on things like your champion, Awoken Hollow, or Thorned Hollow, you want to cast Restores. But this faction also has very high impact cards at 2 and 3 Ember. Bramble Lash is often very good with Thorned Hollow or your champion. You're often starting with things like Sharpen, maybe even Focus Growth, have Restoring Retreats that you might want to cast to overstock a floor, and then you have some great scaling options that are also expensive. And this is just thinking about the cards within your own faction. You know, if you end up getting, you know, a Demon Fiend from another faction or something of that ilk that you want to play, then you're often not doing scaling at the same time. Awoken Railspike sometimes solves that problem, or taking Ember from bosses. You know, there's many ways to solve that problem, but there are definitely going to be fights where you need to be doing things other than stacking Restore on your tank, and you end up not quite being prepared for the boss. If I was going to say that the Awoken had one problem, it's that the high HP units in the last couple of fights are the hardest thing for them to deal with. In terms of raw DPS, it is essentially just Animus of Will that does a great job at taking down enemies. So, like, you give Animus of Will, like, a large stone or a strength stone or something, and, like, you increase its damage output, and when there's more than one tanky enemy in a row, this faction tends to have a lot of problems with that. So I often find that the Awoken has more trouble killing regular enemies than they do bosses. So I've walked into the final fight plenty of times where I'm very confident that I can kill Seraph, but I lack the ability to just kill the regular enemy in waves that have more than, 50 HP or something like that. So that's a problem that you often have to start playing to from early on as Awoken, because killing bosses is a piece of cake. If I had one more issue with the Awoken, it's that they have a similar unit problem. In that, like, the Sentient, the Awoken Hollow, and the Thorn Hollow do the same thing. The Husk Hermit, well, these two do similar things. And then the Husk Hermit and the Shattered Shell do similar things. You don't actually get a lot of variety in what your units do, and that often means your picks are awkward. So if you're offered 2 Awoken drafts in a row, and you're offered Thorn Hollow, and then you're offered Awoken Hollow, and like the other ones don't work for your deck for some reason, you often end up having to pass on a unit because you can't support too many units of the same type. Like, how many sweep units do you really want if you also have spikes already to kill those small units, right? So sometimes, well, frequently I end up prioritizing my secondary clan's banner rather than my primary banner once I have like one of each unit type. Okay, I think that's all I want to say about this. Let's move on to the Stygian. I feel like this one's not a hot take. The Stygian feels like the most powerful clan in a vacuum to me. It is just blessed with so many different strengths. The first being that, like, Tethys is just bonkers. Conduit Tethys is easily the weakest Tethys in most cases. The ability to put either Spell Weakness and Sweep or Frostbite on Tethys, or both if you end up mixing it up, often means that Tethys largely can solo many fights, assuming that she isn't killed by something like Spikes or Sweep. And that's not something that most of the other champions do. Like, the range of fights that this solos, or effectively solos, is extremely high. And sort of as an offshoot of that, Frostbite is very good as a mechanic. So at early Covenant levels, you can do something dumb, like just pick all of the Titan's Tooth that you see and cast them repeatedly, and that will be good enough to just kill everything. On Covenant 25, that's not really true anymore, but the amount of damage that the Frostbite offers to bosses often makes bosses an absolute joke. Even just something like casting 3 flash freezes on a boss over the course of the setup fight means that the boss has a considerably lower life total than you start with. So if you consider like flash freeze as 3 initial damage, then you get like +8, +7, +6, +5, blah 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 blah. You get the idea, right? And like the larger you make this number, the more that damage output stays sustained over time rather than decaying. And the Cuddlebeard artifact in particular that makes your Frostbite not decay. Okay, hold on. Let me confirm names, because I think there's one that's Frostbite doesn't decay. And there's one. Okay. Yeah, okay, that is the same artifact, yeah. So Cuddlebeard, plus 2 stacks of Frostbite when it's applied, and Frostbite doesn't decay, is very, very strong. Not that Frostbite isn't, like, good enough on its own or anything, because it most certainly is. So, like, Tethys is great, Frostbite is great, and probably the easiest scaling option in the entire game. And like this faction is also blessed with great units. Guard of the Unnamed is a totally reasonable tank if you're casting a whole bunch of spells. And Titan Sentry is like A+ tier tank. It like not only tanks, it also kills small units and like ruins multi-strikers and bosses really well, while also like doing scaling. Just super impressed by this unit. Also, speaking of units I'm super impressed about, Lodestone Totem is probably just like the best unit in the game, just hard stop. The ability to repeatedly sap bosses and other enemies allows you to just really do a disgusting amount of damage for few resources. This was a unit that I underrated early on, and I regret that now, but it's okay, you learn from your mistakes. This gets disgusting in multiples, and it also gets disgusting if you have anything else which applies sap. The sap cards as a whole are not particularly great unless you go to Immersion of Magic and supplement them, or you get multiples. But when you can start stacking sap up, you get to do a lot of things. Invalidating enemy attacks, decreasing the power of multi-strikers, providing stupid amounts of scaling versus bosses. And the best thing about this is, like, when the boss, like, your major bosses are just, like, hanging out on the right side of the train, you get to just, like, build sap up on them before they even come out. And that's very good. And if I was going to say one final strength about this faction, it's that your Merchant of Magic upgrades tend to be better than the Merchant of Magic upgrades of other factions. The most obvious of this is Ice Storm. 1 damage to a random enemy unit 5 times. Okay, that's cool on floor 1 and all, but once enemies start having 3 HP or more, it's not great. But just put a single +10 magic upgrade on that, and all of a sudden, this has gone from dealing 5 damage to doing 55 damage. That is an absurd investment for 25 gold. And that's not the only spell that's like that. There's a lot of multi-hitting spells in this faction. Helical Crystallis, Ice Tornado, Titan's Tooth, Ancient Energy. There's a lot of multi-hitting cards that benefit so much from magic power upgrades. And since this faction also has a lot of good but expensive spells, doing like double cost reduction on some of these spells is very powerful as well. So that's a huge list of strengths. Sort of on that note, if I were to talk about the weaknesses of this, it's that many of your cards are expensive. And some of these are commons, right? So Crypt Builder, Titan's Tooth, and Ice Tornado are commons, and so they can start in your deck and kind of like glut your deck early on with relatively uncastable cards. This can be balanced out by things like the various offering cards, such as Offering Token, but it is a problem early on. And especially when you have to deploy your units for the first 2 to 3 turns of the fight, like, a lot of these cards aren't castable when you would really like them to be castable. And this sometimes means that you have to divert to an early Merchant of Magic on floor 2 or 3 when you might want to do other things to make your deck more castable. Another weakness is that the Siren cards are basically garbage, and you really don't want to play them. Siren of the Sea, in particular, is just an embarrassing unit. Like, 5/10 starting stats with only benefiting +1 attack and +1 health on incant is rough. And while Nameless Siren's stats are less embarrassing, when you compare, like, the tankiness and damage output of this to things like Titan Sentry, it's a little embarrassing. This is probably a case where, like, most of the faction is so good that, like, this unit looks poor in comparison, rather than, like, this not being an acceptable unit size. And if there's one more weakness of the plan, it's that there are situations where you are reliant on the draw order of your deck to win a run. This is most pronounced with spell weakness. So spell weakness scales spells power incredibly quickly. So Icy Silophyte and Ethos tend to be the most common sources of spell weakness. And there are going to be times where you have 5 finishers in your deck, but, 30 to 35 cards in your deck, and you have 30 spell weakness stacked up on Seraph, but you need to draw something like your Crypt Builder, Ancient Synergy, Ice Tornado, Helical Crystallis in order to actually get that kill. And there are going to be times that you don't, and you lose the run because of it. Permafrost helps to solve that problem, but you're not always offered it, and sometimes you have to cast spells like these in order to clear a floor early on, so that your fire doesn't die. Yeah, Stygian very strong as a whole. Only weaknesses, in my opinion, are that you have a fair number of expensive spells that are sometimes awkward. The Siren cards aren't great, and spell weakness is sometimes awkward. Go to the Umbra. I love the Umbra. The champion is very good. Well, 2 of the 3 champion options are very good. The last one is kind of a stinker. So, Architect Penumbra lets you build super floors very, very easily, unless you do a lot of cool things with morsels. And Monstrous Penumbra tends to solo the early and mid game with basically no support. Often giving you a lot of time to get off the ground and get running without taking pyre damage in early fights, meaning that you're more likely to be able to take trials in later fights without great risk. One of the biggest strengths of this faction is a single unit, and that's Crucible Collector. Crucible Collector that has at least 31 HP and a decent number of lifesteal stacks tends to be able to do a disgusting amount of damage to Seraph, assuming that you can scale the amount of things that it's eating in some way. Whether that's Morsel Master, Shroud Mitosis, Morsel Maker, a Spike. There's a lot of ways to do it. Crucible Collector is an incredibly powerful unit that doesn't require too much support to be good. Many of the same things can be said of Crucible Warden, but in my mind it's just objectively worse most of the time, because of multi-strike. So this plan has an absurd degree of utility, because your morsels can be blockers, or they can be scaling. And that means that Stage Splitter as a starting card is very interesting. It protects a critical unit on a vital turn. It gives scaling to your units so that you do enough damage or live long enough to actually get kills. And that means that you get a lot of choices, and the more choices you have in a run, the better chance you have of controlling your own destiny. Overall, this unit has great utility. You have things that are giving you additional Ember from time to time, like Mind Collapse or Morsels. You have things that vastly increase your scaling, like Shroud Spike, Prismal Dust, and the awkward Prism Retrieval. Prism Retrieval often gets a little bit more of a pass than Channel Song does, because at least it's an uncommon. You're not wasting a rare pick on taking it. And there's a lot of cards that are situationally extremely powerful. Wretch and Immortal Trade are great examples of that. This faction also has one of the, like, best cards in the game in terms of carrying a run by itself in terms of Void Binding. There's been a lot of talk on Void Binding recently, on the Monster Train subreddit in particular. When you give this thing holdover, it often means that that's the only thing you need to do for the rest of the fight, is cast a holdover on Void Bind, like holdover Void Binding each turn on something like a Monstrous Penumbra, and you can just win even the Seraph fight with that. And very few cards scale that hard by themselves. It sometimes requires some setup, and like sometimes you can't cast it the first time through your deck, but Void Binding is one of the best like hard carry cards in the game. It's extremely powerful in the right circumstances. So, like, the Umbra have multiple great champion options, amazing scaling units like Crucible Collector, great utility as a whole, and some like hard carry cards like Void Binding that are great. That said, in many builds, especially when Umbra is your secondary, the Shade Splitters aren't that good. You often have better things to be doing with your Ember than Shade Splittering. So, like in Fight 1, for example, it's often more important to play some Train Stewards out as additional DPS than it is to play a Shade Splitter as a blocker. So while Shade Splitter has good utility, there are many, many runs where Shade Splitter feels close to uncastable because you need to be doing things like torching opposing units, playing out your creatures, and that sometimes makes that sometimes makes units like Crucible Collector and Crucible Warden a little bit awkward early on before you've like thinned your deck a little bit or acquired some bonus Ember from one source or another. Another weakness is that many of your units have setup time before they do anything. And we're going to look at a certain robot who is the classic example of this. So when I first saw Alloyed Construct, I was like, holy crap, this is insane. He hits for 50 each turn. And then you realize that, like, fuel decreases even if you're not attacking, and that, like, the first turn you play him, he hasn't gorged yet, so he can't attack yet. And you realize quickly that this unit is frequently more of a trap than you thought it was going to be. And versus bosses, it very frequently runs out of fuel before it dies. So you have many units that require setup time. Overgorger, Allied Construct, both of the Crucible creatures. You have units that ask a lot from you in terms of resources, and when a fight is tough or you've taken a bad trial and you don't have time to set things up, things can get exponentially worse very quickly. You also have some cards in this faction that are frequently awkward for one reason or another. So, like, Shadow Eater is a unit that I don't think I have literally ever picked. Like, this unit has 0 starting attack. It, like, gorges and kills support units, but that's often something that you want to be doing with Antumbra Assault or Mind Collapse instead, because that's just better. Or, like, you have awkward things like Ember Forge, which offer you a bunch of Ember, but, like, die to a Stiff Breeze. There's definitely some awkwardness in terms of units within this faction. Perhaps the biggest problem with this faction is actually a certain enemy. Let me see if I can pull this up. Probably already know what I'm talking about. Talk about Overcharged Tank. So at Covenant 23 and above, this thing has 95 starting health, and whenever a unit dies on that floor, it gains 10 armor. Let's assume that this thing starts with 2 other things on its floor, okay? Realistically, making this thing's health closer to 115. And let's assume that you're playing some morsels. And all of a sudden, this thing's health is more in the range of like 135 or even above. It's even worse if like something like spikes or sweep happens and a whole bunch of your morsels end up dying. This can be the sort of unit which, like, due to your setup, ends up giving you like 50 more armor on that sucker, and it becomes a problem to kill, especially if you're not on monstrous Penumbra. So an overcharged tank has been the death of many of my Umbra runs, especially if I'm like Umbra melting combination and a whole bunch of my stuff is dying anyway. So harvest units or slay units sometimes end up being a problem for this combination. Sweep units in particular often do a lot of damage to like Morsel Master and Morsel Maker based floors. But as a whole, the Umbra is probably my favorite. And I think the Stygian's most powerful, but the Umbra runs are often quite interesting. I say probably because I have very complicated thoughts on the melting. I'm gonna grab a drink of water here. The melting are, I think, unquestionably the most interesting and most difficult to play. You have a lot of different things that you can do, a lot of ways to approach a run, many ways to pivot a run midway through, and an extremely high number of difficult choices that... So, in terms of, I guess, like, weaknesses, this is not a clan that is easy to play, and the strategy is not often linear. So, with Stygian, like, most of your runs can be won by playing a tank or two in front of Tethys, and letting Tethys, like, totally body things, and then you just, like, kind of have to come up with a way to scale a little bit harder to beat Seraph. But with Melting, like, you have Burnout to manage. You have Reform to manage. You have non-Burnout, non-traditionally reformed units to manage from your secondary clan. You have a ton of situational cards. There's a lot going on here. And the difficulty in playing Melting is often that, like, you need to look at your starting deck and your starting artifact and your starting champion and figure out, like, how am I hedging towards the future in which I win this run? And sometimes that involves doing very weird things. The runs where early on you're not able to take the Burn Bright version of Rector Flicker often end up being significantly harder than the other runs. The Reformed Champion is very powerful if things work out well, but is often awkward and fragile. And the Harvest Champion is fine, and probably better than people give it credit for. But it's weird because, like, you often want to put it at the back of a floor so that it gets the greatest number of harvest triggers, but, like, once it has the harvest triggers, it's a great tank. There's some very weird tension there. And tension is kind of the name of the game with this faction, because you often are playing on either the maintain burnout axis or the reform axis, and you don't have space to play both, but your starting cards sometimes give you both. And, like, if you're playing a reform strategy, you have to leave enough space to reform your good units so you can use them twice versus bosses, but you have to leave that space while also making sure you're doing enough DPS to kill the enemies. that are like coming through in traditional waves. There's a lot to think about. And many of your cards are situational. Let me make sure this is on screen. Yes, it is. I'm in the top corner. Okay. So if we take a look at my other factions versus Melting, you'll see that by a huge majority, I have golded fewer Melting cards than cards from other factions. And it's not just a little bit more, it's almost double the amount of my other faction that I haven't golded most of the cards for. And this is due to so many of the cards not being takeable under normal circumstances. I think the rares will probably illustrate this well. So there are a lot of cards where under the right circumstances they're insane, and then if they're not insane they do nothing, and there's very little in between. Bounty Stalker is a great example of that. With Intent on Death or Reform or Endless or something like that, Bounty Stalker can be incredibly powerful. But if you're not playing that kind of run, the card does nothing. Legion of Wax, when upgraded, especially with Lodestone, can solo bosses by itself. But if you don't have an upcoming Merchant of Steel, or you don't have Intent on Death, the card is considerably weaker. You know, this card is rather embarrassing versus a lot of enemies, especially like the Sweep boss, without a good upgrade. Similarly, Formless Child is huge amounts of scaling, but if you don't have the space or the Ember to work with it, it's problematic. Big Sludge can scale hard, but like space concerns are an issue with this costing 3 slots. You end up with a lot of very situational cards that oftentimes just don't work on your runs. Memento Mori is another great example, where like that is a nuke versus high HP enemies or bosses, but it like both does nothing early, and if you're not killing enough of your units or reforming them or whatever, it's not great either. Similarly to Umbra, this faction sometimes struggles with units like Overcharged Tank that have Harvest and gain armor. Spikes can be a problem with your starting dregs. And the most obvious complaint of Melting primary starts is that sometimes you will lose a run solely due to the draw order of your deck. This is most pronounced with Burn Bright Rector Flicker, where, like, say you have 2 enablers for it in your starting deck, that's enough to, like, certainly play it. But what happens when those cards are on the bottom of your deck in Fight 1, and all of a sudden you have no damage output for the boss? You know, you die or close to it. And the same tends to be true of floors 1 and 2, and then things tend to have smoothed out by then due to like card removes or adding extra enablers to your deck. And those starts are like memorable and frustrating because like you had the answers and just purely due to luck or chance, it doesn't work out. And that just kind of is what it is. Let's talk about strengths of the Melting now, because I do think they have a lot of strengths. The first one is the overall strength of the units in this faction is insane. So like, let's just look at Lady of the House. To be offered a 2-slot 2540 unit is absolute gas. Like, compare those numbers to something like Alpha Fiend, or even Demon Fiend. Like, it is a huge improvement over this. And yes, Demon Fiend costs more, but like looking back at Melting again, like for a quarter of the cost, you have about half of the stats. So you are offered very powerful units. Your units are just a little bit more situational because they have burnout, or they have things that you have to like really work for in order to make them good. So the power level of the spells tends to be above average. Sorry, let me rephrase it. The power level of the cards in this faction tends to be above average. They're just more situational. So, like, Engulfed in Smoke is a stupid card that lets you, like, very easily win a lot of boss fights by just turning all of your things invisible. But you also might have Burnout that you need to maintain, and something like a Lady of the Reformed, where if you give your units too much stealth, then your Burnout's unit die because the Lady isn't getting hit. Or you get spells that just, like, kill something, but also kill one of your own units, which may be good or it may be bad in some scenarios. This faction has extremely good holdover options, like Engulfed in Smoke, Crushing Demise, even something like as simple as an Intent on Death or a Purifying Cleanse can be very good in a lot of scenarios. Or even Holdover Molded or Holdover Wicklash can be just fine. Holdover Subsuming Blade. You get the idea here. Holdover is very good in this faction. A hidden boon of this faction that I didn't realize early on, but became more and more clear to me as I played more, is how little Ember you need to succeed with this faction. So, between your starting units costing 0, and many of your spells being free or 1 Ember, you can often get by on melting runs with taking 0 or 1 Ember upgrades over the course of the entire run. Which is often not true of other factions. I usually find that I need Ember once at some point in the run. And the dregs also self-remove themselves from the deck. So, like, you're going through, you play your dregs, you let them die, and the second pass through your deck is much smaller. And that leads to more consistent, like, boss fight turns by quite a bit. Perhaps the coolest thing about the melting, though, is that Paraffin Thug and Wickless Tycoon, as well as some of your artifacts, allow you to farm gold during a fight. And killing your own units or setting up enemies and bosses to die in certain situations allows you to min-max the amount of gold that you are getting. I recently watched a run that Jorbs played where he, like, it was something along the line of, like, put a health upgrade on Paraffin Thugs, give Paraffin Thugs multi-strike, and then he duplicated it 5 times. And he was just netting hundreds of extra gold every fight and doing disgusting things with traps. And there's a lot of really cool things you can do, where you set up, say, a Wickless Tycoon and a Legion of Wax on the same floor, and the boss melts through Legion of Wax, resulting in you getting a whole bunch of money. And there's a lot of cool things you can do with Reform and Burnout, and, like, setting up kills on certain creatures that make you get a lot of value out of your shops. And when you are decreasing the cost of your spells in your shops, that further makes it so you don't have to take Ember from bosses, which all in all kind of, like, leads to this feedback cycle of your deck getting, like, stronger and stronger and stronger over time. So the melting get a bad reputation for being a little bit inconsistent because, like, there are very frustrating moments with the melting where your early losses in particular are just 100% completely outside of your control and it kills a streak. But once a melting run gets going, it tends to do very, very well. I almost never lose a mid-game melting run. Like, I either, like, lose on floor 1 or 2, or, like, I'm making it all the way to Seraph, and, like, Seraph is the only thing that can kill me at that point. Yeah. I guess one last thing with melting, you do have to have some way of scaling for the Seraph fight. So, Lady of the Reformed plus Burnbright Champion gets you through pretty much every fight other than Seraph by itself. And then for the Seraphite, where you're looking at doing like 3,000 some odd damage, you do need something a little bit more degenerate to push that last damage through. Whether that's going to be something like Stealth, or a Bounty Stalker that has grown, you know, a real big Legion of Wax that can do a whole bunch of damage, Formless Child reforming some stuff. You have plenty of options for scaling, but you do need something a little bit more unfair most of the time. And sometimes that can come from your secondary faction, you know. A multi-strike on Rector Flicker off a One Horns Tome, for example, does a lot of work in increasing your DPS. Or a bunch of, like, I don't know, something else that gives Lady of the Reformed extra survivability, like some armor or something, can do a ton of work as well. So overall, I'm very happy with all of the clans. They all do tend to have their strengths and weaknesses. I do think the Stygian is pretty clearly the most powerful right now. And while Melting has the reputation for being the weakest other than that, I think that's largely due to, like, the streak-breaking nature of some of the early Melting runs, rather than it being objectively weaker. So, like, for example, I found it easier to get Melting primary wins than to get all the Hellhorned primary wins. Like, my last two I had to complete were Hellhorned Awoken and Hellhorned Umbra, and I had just, like, fallen just short with those combinations multiple times before getting the win. Whereas I think once I sat down and tried to get my Melting wins, it was very easy for me to do so. Yeah. Overall, still loving this game. Still will be making content for it, and probably trying to do a bunch of win streaking, or occasionally some viewer requests for specific combinations that people want to see. I hope you found this useful today. Have a great rest of the day.